Hey guys, I've got a really cool video for you here today. We're going to be talking about and starting a series of books that are life-changing. Now, one accomplishment I'm very proud of in life is reading 1,000 books. And among those, there were some ones that truly changed my life, that made me a better person, that made me see the world differently, that made me see myself and humanity differently, that completely changed me for the rest of my life. And we're going to start out with one of those today. I don't know if it's the most influential on me, but it's definitely my favorite in terms of enjoying the read. I've read it 6 times as well as listened to it maybe 3 times on Audible. And so this is something I'm coming close to double-digit times going through this book. I've also taken a college course on the author of this book, John Milton, as well as went through a very long lecture series on this book itself. So to start out, John Milton wrote Paradise Lost in 1667. At that time, he was blind. I want to tell you a little bit about John Milton because it's an interesting story. John Milton wrote Paradise Lost after he completely lost his sight. This was very traumatic for him. He had been someone who spent his entire life reading and writing up to that point. That was his entire life. And in those times, that was before television, computers, anything. Obviously, it's 1667, right? So if you lost your sight, you basically spent your time sitting there doing nothing. There was no radio to put on. There was no music to listen to. There was no television to turn on. It was just you in the solitude of your mind. Now, luckily, John Milton was probably a genius and also had accumulated so much knowledge in his life that by the time he lost his sight, he was able to still dictate all of this, all of Paradise Lost to his wife and have her write it down for him. There was another book that he wrote that is not as good, but still great, and gives you good insight to how big of a deal losing his sight was to him. And that book is Samson Agonistes, which is about the biblical character of Samson, who, if you've ever read the Bible story, he's captured by the Philistines and gets his eyes gouged out, so he no longer can see, and he still ends up serving God and accomplishing an earthly purpose without his sight, even though he spends a lot of years chained to a millstone grinding away like a cattle animal. And Milton, in many ways, felt the same. He really resonated with Samson, and he really felt like it was a big deal to lose his sight. One of my favorite poems of all time is also written by Milton, and it's called On His Blindness. It's a very deep poem, and we don't have time to get into it here, but I want to share it with you because I think it is a very remarkable poem, and if you want to take some time to think about the wording, there's a lot of dual meanings in it, and it's a very depth-filled poem. So it goes like this. When I consider how my light is spent, ere half my days in this dark world, and wide that one talent which was death to hide, lodged with me useless, though my soul more bent, to serve there with my Maker, and present my true account, lest he returning chide. Doth God exact day labor light denied? I fondly ask for patience to prevent. That murmur soon replies, God does not need either man's works or his own works. Who best bears his mild yoke, they serve him best. His state is kingly, thousands at his bidding speed, and post or land and ocean without rest. They also serve who only stand and wait. That is On His Blindness by John Milton, and I seriously urge you to look into that poem and to contemplate it a little bit. But I wanted to start out introducing you a little bit to Milton and who he was. Now, he wrote Paradise Lost in 1667. The big debate at the time, I've got a couple versions of it here. This is my favorite in terms of the book itself. I like how it's laid out in here with the double lines. But I also have this cool special edition gilded one that's unabridged, and it's got a bunch of artwork by Gustave Dior in it, and very, very cool artwork, so I love that. I believe I have another just cheap soft cover version at home as well. I really like this book. It follows the tradition of epic poetry. So it is an epic poem, which is a very, very long poem that almost takes on a novel and book form. There was a tradition starting with the Greeks. Probably the most famous and earliest versions of epic poetry are the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are very famous Greek poems by Homer. And there's been a few since then. There's been Virgil's Aeneid. There's been Ovid's Metamorphosis. Let's see what else. Not Epic of Gilgamesh, but Beowulf. Essentially, it's very, very long stories of kind of an epic journey, an epic hero's journey, written in some type of poetic verse. And so what Milton wrote in, and this was a big debate of his time, was rhyming versus unrhymed. Milton chose to do his in unrhymed. So there's no rhyming, even though it's considered poetry. What makes it poetry is he wrote it all in iambic pentameter. Pentameter means 10. Iambic pentameter is 10 syllables per line, alternating stressed and unstressed. So when I consider how my light is spent, ere half my days in this dark world and wide. Those are iambic 10-syllable lines. So the entire poem, which is, to give you an idea, in this single line one, the entire poem is 383 pages long. So 383 pages of iambic pentameter. He also uses a massive vocabulary in this of north of 7,000 individual unique words. What's incredible about that is if you're famous with some of the modern authors like Rowland and Tolkien, I don't know who does the Twilight series, but these type of authors, all of their books put together oftentimes are maybe only approaching 5,000 or 6,000 unique words used in all of their books. This one 383-page poem uses close to 8,000. I think it's like 7,900 unique words, which means it has a very immense vocabulary, which is also impressive considering it was written in the 1600s without access to, a lot of the easy tools like a thesaurus and stuff that we can use today. And keep in mind, he was also blind when he wrote this, so he was dictating this to his wife to write down. So this is truly incredible. It's also, I have written some poetry in iambic pentameter, and I have an 11-page sort of starting of an epic poem that I did a few years ago. And I can say it's very difficult and time-consuming. Even at 11 pages took me a couple months to really hone in the words and to make sure everything was in iambic pentameter. You get stalled a lot trying to think, well, how do I say what I want to say in these next few lines while keeping this perfect cadence. So it's a very difficult thing to do. This was such an amazing piece of writing at the time that it stopped other writers and poets and playwrights really from writing for almost 100 years after he published this. At that time, there were not as many people who were literate, right? So we're talking about a much smaller percentage of the population who could read and write. almost everyone, and there was also a much smaller amount of books in circulation, right? So because there were so many less people who could write, there were much less books being written. There was much less circulation of books. There wasn't translation of books from all these different cultures. So really there was the Western canon, which was the main pieces of Western literature. And if you were someone who was a playwright, who was a novelist, who was a poet, etc., in Milton's time and thereafter, this was probably one of the most famous pieces of literature known to you at the time. So basically everyone had read it, and it was so amazing and so epic and so just unfathomably beyond anything that anyone had read before or written themselves, that it really gave the Western culture in Europe a collective writing block where people just stopped writing, because how do you top something like that? How do you make something better than that? You just couldn't. It was like everything else people were writing was just garbage when compared to this, and when you read it, the way it flows, the language in it is so beautiful and so amazing. There's nothing I've ever read like it. I personally consider it the magnum opus of the English language, meaning the best piece of literature to ever come out of the English language, with a few close contenders, but I still think it takes the cake. Incredible book. So what is it? Why does it make you a better person reading it? Well, there's a few reasons. This tackles some of the most difficult philosophical questions of human history, something that people have struggled with for thousands of years. It also challenges some of the paradigms of the Christian faith. It asks questions that people were afraid to ask at the time. And it also kind of takes things somewhat from the eyes of the devil, which was never really done before, and even in his time was treading on the lines of blasphemy and heresy to write anything as if it was from the devil. In fact, in many ways you could say the devil is the loose term hero of the story. He's an anti-hero, but nonetheless, he is kind of the main person the story centers around. Although some would debate, who've really studied it, as I have, that Jesus is actually the main thing in the story. So Paradise Lost, the name references the biblical Genesis story of Adam and Eve being in the Garden of Eden, and they eat the fruit and they're kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and so they lose paradise, and that's the reference of Paradise Lost. And there's one of the most beautiful poetic renditions, a retelling of that happening in this book. But what he tries to do, and he says this early on, is an attempt to justify God's ways to man. Milton had spent his entire life thinking about a lot of the philosophical questions that bothered people like Nietzsche, Carl Jung, even after this. Perhaps they didn't read his work or weren't super familiar with it. Perhaps they didn't agree with him, I'm not sure, but they were on a long tradition of people who had questioned this type of work, or this type of paradigm. And what that is why would God create Satan knowing that he would be bad, knowing that he would be destined to be evil and be doomed to hell from his very creation and lead so many astray? Why even create him? And in some ways it seems as though it's a tragic story for the creature Satan, who's doomed, and unlike us, who have a chance at redemption. If you believe the Christian story, Milton was very religious. Milton believed that we as human beings had a second chance because of the Jesus story, the Christ story. We had redemption, but the devil never had a chance at redemption. So it's very complicated. It's a very, very complicated things. So he seeks to address that in Paradise Lost and answer some of those very difficult questions. Some of the soliloquies of the devil and Adam and Eve are absolutely mesmerizing as well as thought-provoking. When you read this book, what I don't want to do is spoil everything for you, but you will be exposed to one of the most beautifully written pieces of poetry and epic poems ever written in the history of humankind. You'll be exposed to one of the deepest, most meaningful works ever. What's put into this is just beyond the knowledge that anyone has today. There are professors who spend their entire lives studying this one book and don't feel that they have it very well mastered. It's that deep. I heard a professor and his wife who had spent their lives studying Milton's work, and they said Milton probably knew more as a teenager than most professors do today after 30 years in the field. And that is because in Milton's time, he was dedicated kind of by his parents and his place in life to read and learn and spend time doing that. And so he spent 7 days a week, 10 hours a day reading in the old languages and English and taking in incredible amounts of information. And so what we do in our modern world is just nothing even close to that. I think a PhD education is something that Milton would have easily gone beyond in his realm, probably in his youth, his very early youth. So, brilliant man. And so when you're reading this, you're reading just the knowledge encapsulated in it, the geographical knowledge, the historical knowledge, the philosophical knowledge, etc., that only this man could have put together, along with some of the most beautiful poetic writing you've ever heard in your life. You'll also find out how much of history, how much is influenced by Milton's writings. You may be turned on to some of his other works, as I was, like Samson Agonistes, the morning of Christ's nativity, some of his poems like On His Blindness. But there's also, I believe, a Paradise Regained, which I read a few years ago. I actually read it twice. I think with his work, twice is a minimum to understand really anything that's going on. Samson Agonistes I read 3 or 4 times, and like I said, Paradise Lost I've almost read 10 times now. So his stuff is very, very complicated. But how it changed me as a person, it helped me to understand some philosophical questions that everyone has if they were raised Christian or if they discovered Christianity later in life. There's a lot of philosophical questions that are unanswered that this book does a really good job of answering and giving you an amazing perspective on. It makes you much more cultured. Knowing Milton, knowing what he wrote about, understanding iambic pentameter, memorizing some of the lines in this, understanding more about everything that's in Paradise Lost will make you a much more cultured person. You want to impress a professor or a date or whatever. If you know some Milton, that's pretty impressive if you can have a conversation about someone like that and understand what they were talking about. If you want to grow in your faith journey, that's another reason you should read this. If you're someone who wants nothing to do with faith, wants nothing to do with Christianity, you want to understand why people believe it, you want to understand some of these dynamics, you want to understand, some of the things that you really question about, what and who and how and why, as far as the devil and the Adam and Eve story and God and stuff like that. It's a great work on that. It's also very challenging, and I think as men, to read something that's so challenging and difficult and requires so much depth and learning will really change who you are. It will change the way you read and the way you look at the world. And everything that I've talked about in this video, put together in a package of a book. Reading this it's just life-changing. It's like one of those books that you read, and after it, every time you read it, actually, you're sitting there thinking. You're thinking about it, and you have sleepless nights contemplating the philosophy of it, contemplating the storyline, and recalling just these beautiful poetic lines that you remember from it, and thinking about these epic images. I can't even describe how beautiful the language is. I want to read you guys a line here just so I can, I think it's book 5 is a very beautiful book, but I just want to read a little bit of this so that you can kind of see what it sounds like reading it. Now mourn her rosy steps in the eastern clime, advancing sowed the earth with orient pearl. When Adam waked, so customed from his sleep, was airy light from poor digestion bred, and temperate vapors bland, which the only sound of leaves and firming rills, Aurora's fan, lightly dispersed in the shrill matin song of birds on every bough. So much the more his wonder was to find unwakened Eve, with tresses discomposed and growling cheek, as though on quiet rest he on his side, leaning half raised with looks of cordial love, hung over her enamored and beheld beauty, which whether waking or asleep shot forth peculiar graces. Then with voice mild, as when Zephyrus on Flora breathes, her hand soft touching, whispered thus, Awake, my fairest, my espoused, my latest found, heaven's last best gift, my ever new delight. Awake, the morning shines, and the fresh field calls us. We lose the prime, to mark how spring our tendered plants, how blows the citron grove, what drop the myrrh and the balmy reed. How nature paints her colors, how the bee sits on the bloom extracting liquid sweet. Such whispering waked her, but with startled eye on Adam, whom embracing thus she spoke, O soul in whom my thoughts find all repose, my glory, my perfection, glad I see thy face, and mourn return, for I this night, such night till this I never passed, have dreamed, if dreamed not as I oft am wont of their works of day past, or morrow's next design, but of offense and trouble, which my mind knew never till this irksome night. I won't read anymore, but I just wanted you to get a very short taste of this poetic flow and just beautiful language that's encapsulated there. So I'm going to be going over a few books in upcoming series that I believe are life-changing books, things that you read that you will never regret, that will make you a better person in many different ways. This is one of the more poetic, philosophical, poetic works that I'm going to mention. I'm going to talk about Carl Jung's Ion, which Jordan Peterson put as the scariest book he ever read. And there's good reason for that. It's absolutely terrifying and mind-shattering and paradigm-shattering. It's one of the most intense psychology books I've ever read in my life. I'm going to be going over some books that are truly like Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, which contemplate some of the deepest moral questions of humankind. One of the first delves into the realm of dark psychology, and all encapsulated in a beautiful story that is gripping and challenging and thrilling. So we're going to get to some of those. Please like this video, please share, please subscribe. Check out some of my other stuff. I do fragrance reviews, I do some stuff on relationships. I do some stuff on supplements. I'm going to be uploading some stuff on like weight training and fitness and things like that. I'm going to be doing some style guides. Just in general, lots of stuff that men can use to better their lives and become more cultured, to dress better, to look better, to be more intelligent, to be more efficient, etc. So follow the channel, like the video, and stay tuned for more great content.